Ooh, I don't like this angle. No, we gotta change that. What happened? I had a good angle. What happened to my angle? So I have a lot of books, and it's ridiculous, and I have been needing to go through them and sort them for a very long time. So basically, I'm just gonna go through all of this. I'm gonna go through, yes, I have a lot of books. I'm going to sort them into books that I'm gonna keep and books that I'm going to get rid of, and I'm going to go through all of them and I'm going to talk about them. That's what's going to happen. So let's just get started. Let's not beat around the bush. Let's dig into this. I'm just gonna pull these out randomly. And obviously I haven't read all of these books. I'm just going to kind of pull them all out, and when I come across a book that I have read, I'm just going to talk about it. The first one I pulled here, Transformers Exodus. I don't really know how to go about reviewing these books. Do I start by telling you if it's a good book or a bad book? Well, let me just start with this. There are two Transformers books, Transformers Exodus and Transformers Exile, and I think Transformers Exodus came first, and if that's the case, then this is the one that I read, because I started reading Exiles, and I never finished it. These are my two Transformers novels, and they were written to be in the continuity of the Michael Bay movies, I think, but there's like retconning and stuff that doesn't quite fit, like, of course, but Transformers Exodus, I read this years ago in high school. I'm old. And I did enjoy it. Gee, not much to say about it. If you're a Transformers fan, like, I would say good book to read. I mean, the pacing might have been a little bit fast for me, but it was good for kind of just like delving into the characters more than you would be able to see on screen. I guess I can get rid of this. I don't think I'll ever read it again. I'm gonna put it in the giveaway pile. Transformers Exiles, I feel like I kind of want to keep it because I never actually finished it. But then I feel like if I'm gonna keep this one, I want to keep both of them. See, this is my problem. I have such a hard time parting with my books. I'm gonna keep them. We're already off to a bad start. Miracle at Philadelphia. This is such a good book. And I think this is like my favorite book about the Constitution that I've ever read, and if you want to learn about the Constitution, this is the first book that I would recommend. It is so good. But I'm telling you right now, if you couldn't tell, the genre is going to be all over the place. 100% disjunctive, you do not know what you're gonna get. So this book, War and Genocide, I think I bought this for my history class, and it looks like I have this entire book annotated, so I guess I read the whole thing. I seem to recall thinking this book was very informative and learning a lot from it, but now I don't remember anything that I read, so a lot of good that did me. Okay, The Gifts of Imperfection by Brené Brown. PhD, LMSW. So The Gifts of Imperfection. I bought this book my first year of college because I was feeling extremely bad about myself, and you know that I was feeling extremely bad about myself because I went on Amazon and I ordered a self-help book that's written for 45-year-old moms. All that being said, like, I know I'm kind of traducing this, but this actually is a pretty nice, quaint little self-help book. Like, obviously it didn't exactly turn my life around, and like, there's no miracle book that's gonna do that for you. Granted, this woman, like, the author herself, I think she must have been on TED Talks or something, and it said that she wrote this book because she had an emotional breakdown, and this book kind of is a retrospective of the emotional and cognitive journey that she took to turning herself around. And then she, like, said that she had an emotional breakdown because she published a book about how she had an emotional breakdown, and I'm like, woman. Like, it's just, seems pretty emotionally mercurial for a woman that's trying to push, like, emotional stability, but, I mean, she's transparent about it, so, anyway, you don't have to read into all that. It's a good book. Oh, shit, I have annotations in it. Damn it, I really have, like, I have this habit of writing in all of my books, and I know that most people are like, oh my god, you write in your books? That's book abuse. Like, listen, I just really love annotating when I read because I just do. I feel like I can put this in the, I kind of feel like I want to keep it though. Damn it. I'm gonna keep it. I'm gonna keep it. I'm gonna keep it. I'm gonna keep it. Oh god, I haven't read this book, but I stole it from my history teacher. He wasn't even my history teacher, actually. He was my homeroom teacher, and he happened to teach history, and he advised the history club, which I founded, by the way. I feel like he might have lent me this book and said, just make sure you give it back at the end of the year, and I obviously, if I did not give it back. But I didn't read it, and so I can't review it, so let's just move on and not give myself even more to edit out. Oh, Scarlet. Interesting. This is by Alexandra Ripley. This is if you didn't know, is a sequel to Gone with the Wind, which was by Margaret Mitchell, and I believe it was the only book that Margaret Mitchell ever published. I read Gone with the Wind, I must have been 12 or 13 when I read that book, and I really, really loved it. It's like still one of my favorite books that I ever read, so when I was that age I picked up this book, and I never finished this because it's not very good. Like, I just remember being extraordinarily disappointed about how disjointed it was from Margaret Mitchell's approach. And I know that, like, I don't want to rip too hard on Alexandra Ripley, like, I'm sure that you're a good lady and that you stan Margaret Mitchell as much as the next guy, but like, just wasn't as good. It was not as immersive, it wasn't paced as well. It was like I feel like she was trying to be kind of like as sesquipedalian as Margaret Mitchell was to like imitate the style, but instead she just ended up coming up with like a ton of like filler and wordcraft and really inconsequential monologues. I did not finish the book, and I'm probably never going to actually read it. Like, I feel like I want to read it just to say that I did. So I don't know, I should probably get rid of this. Like, I feel like nope, I'm gonna keep it. Oh god. Ooh boy, this is another book that I never finished and then I started, Gods and Generals by Jeff Shaara. Like, I don't want to talk too much about books that I haven't actually finished, but I read Killer Angels, which I have around here somewhere. And if you didn't know, Gettysburg, the movie, was based on Killer Angels by Michael Shaara, Jeff Shaara's, was it Michael's? Ooh, God, I don't remember what his first name was. Well, whatever. This author's dad wrote the movie that Gettysburg is based on. And then this guy, the son, went on to write several sequels, and I really enjoyed Killer Angels, so I thought I'd really enjoy the sequels, but then I realized that Jeff Shaara is not as good a writer as his father, in my opinion anyway. I know that a lot of people really enjoy Jeff Shaara's work, and I know that he's like really friendly and is constantly like in Gettysburg signing autographs and stuff, and I think that's really cool. He's not for me though. I really, really don't like the way he paces and constructs sentences. Like, I don't remember what his quirk, what his little writing quirk was, but I seem to remember it's like he'll join two independent clauses with a comma. So it was like you constantly have these funky stream of consciousness run-on sentences that are squished together, and it's so unenjoyable. Like, it's, yeah, like I should be the last person to criticize people for writing run-on sentences, because God knows that I also have a habit of doing that, but you can tell that it's just his whole, like, it's that whole stream of consciousness thing. It's just, it's his quirk, and I don't like it. And that's okay, because we're all entitled to our opinions, and I'm gonna keep this book. James Madison by Lynn Cheney. Whoo boy, she has not been touched for a while, and she is covered in dust, and I have to sneeze. Okay, I think I'm good. This book is not good. If you want to read a biography about James Madison, this is one of the last ones that I would recommend, and I know that that's probably an unpopular opinion because Lynn Cheney wrote this book to be very palatable for people that don't know a lot about James Madison and don't like reading like really long-winded comprehensive biographies, but it's the kind of book where it's like squicky history because she conveniently omits like a lot of important facts to paint this guy in the best light, and she put like a lot of emphasis on other like small things. Like, I remember that in the beginning when she was going through his early life, she like really put a lot of emphasis on the possibility that he had epilepsy, which is a very unsubstantiated, very nebulous part of his life. Like, I think most historians agree that James Madison did not suffer from what we would now call epilepsy. And I'm not going to get into that whole discourse, and whether he did or not is not really the point. The point is that she put a lot of emphasis on it when he only wrote about it like 2 times in his whole 85 years of living, and like the reason that she talked about it at length so much was to make it seem like he was this like underdog, long sufferer, and he was stigmatized. All I'm saying is she was really trying to like make a big hero out of this guy because he's like, because he's one of the least conventionally interesting founding fathers in our modern purview, and she was really trying to like dramatize his life and make it seem like it was more than it was. And it's like, there is a lot of interesting things about James Madison. You don't have to like make shit up. It's just not a good book. It's not good unbiased history. It's like really selective and poorly constructed, and I don't like it. But I'm gonna keep it. I'm probably going to keep most of my early American history books. Here's another book about basically the same subject, Madison and Jefferson by Andrew Burstein and Nancy Eisenberg jointly. They wrote this book together. She is also covered in dust, has not been touched for a while. I love this book. This is seriously one of the best like non-fictional books in general that I think I've ever read. It's an extremely comprehensive biopic, and it has a thesis that it works to proving throughout the entire duration. And this is like 800 pages of straight historical facts, and I know that people have issues with Nancy Eisenberg because she wrote an Aaron Burr biography that like people don't vibe with. And Andrew Burstein, I've tried to read other books of his and I'm not particularly a fan of him, but when these two got together to write this book, oh my god, they did such an amazing job. Like, I read this book like a novel, and what I really love about this book is the thesis. It is seeking out to prove that James Madison was the primary impetus in the accomplishments that these two together made as political partners, because most people tend to think that Thomas Jefferson was the sort of the leader and James Madison was like his loyal puppy, like his details man and his like hype man, and that is farthest from the truth. Like, I already knew that that was stupid even before I read this book, and this book just like further served to completely solidify the impression that I already had from biographies that I had read prior. And it's very good, and it's very interesting, and like seriously, I recommend it to anybody. It's such a good read. The Federalist Papers. I have a confession to make. I have not read every Federalist essay. Ooh, dust. Actually, the most significant kind of like thing I can talk about in conjunction with the Federalist Papers is that in high school I entered a contest where I had to analyze Federalist number 10 by James Madison, and it was supposed to be, I think, like 5,000 words, and I ended up writing like, I don't know, 25,000 words. Like, it was a 30-page, like a 38.5 by 11 page document, and I had to seriously cut into it just so that I could turn it in, and that was extremely painful for me. These essays, I mean, needless to say, they're an extremely important part of early American history, and it's really interesting to read between the three authors. They were written between Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, and it's like just fun, and they all wrote under the same pseudonym. They were writing under the pretense that these were all written by just one person, but it's fun to flip through the different essays and you can tell who wrote it based on things like the syntax, the style, the vocabulary, like all that kind of stuff. And that, I just love that. This is like one of the most interesting and fun early American primary sources that I think a person could read, so I'm gonna keep it. Obviously. Founding Brothers by, who is this? Joseph J. Ellis. Yes, Joseph J. Ellis is one of my favorite early American history writers. He writes in an extremely consumable, palatable way, and I really love how he kind of goes about eruditely characterizing the Founding Fathers as people, really in deep about their relationships with one another, and that's like the main thing that I love about history. So this book was like made for me, I swear to God, and I really enjoyed it, and it's pretty short, so it's kind of like you can get through it pretty quickly. There was a PBS, actually I don't know if it was PBS, but there was a documentary of the same name called Founding Brothers, which I believe was at least partly inspired or based on this book, and that documentary sucks. I have it on DVD. And I don't like it for a variety of reasons, but we're not here to review documentaries, we're here to review books, and this is a good book. I'm gonna keep it. The Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. To be honest, I don't remember too much about this book, but I remember, oh my god, I forgot that I had this bookmark. Benjamin Franklin, if you don't know, was seriously into everything. But like one of the things that is my favorite thing about him is that he had like a wild sense of humor, and there's definitely kind of underpinnings of that comedic propensity in his autobiography. It is written in the kind of stilted and wooden sort of academic, you know, 18th century style, but if you can get through that, and then I definitely think this book is worth it to read, and he's an extremely fascinating person. I can't even describe Benjamin Franklin, forget it, but I'm going to keep this book, I know that. 1776 by David McCullough, David McCullough, who is, if you don't know, one of the most, if not the most high-profile modern American history authors, and he writes across the whole span of American history, and this, I think, is the only book by him that I've ever read, and it's one of his most famous books. I wasn't a huge fan of it, and I know that, like, people in the early American history circle would probably want to kill me for saying that. And I'm not saying it's a bad book. It's not a bad book. There was so much hype about it and it wasn't as good as I was expecting, but I think that's really mainly because of my taste. David McCullough is a really good writer with a very palatable approach to writing in such a way that it's very easy to understand. It's paced very breezily. It's not too slow, not too fast, and he kind of covers all the important beats in whatever event that he's writing about. But 1776 in particular, like, you can easily infer, is just a lot of war politics because he just mostly focuses on the actual progress of the various battles during the War for Independence in this specific year. So for that, I really am not a fan of war politics. I think they're super, super boring. I think battles and, like, maneuvers and formations and, like, which regiments showed up at which area at which time and killed this many people, like, is so freaking boring to me. And that's just, like, a lot of what this book is. Granted, like, if anybody was gonna write about that stuff and, like, make it as interesting as it could be, it would be David McCullough, but if it's not your taste, at least in my case, even he couldn't make it interesting for me. So I did finish the book. Like, I did manage to get through the entire thing, but I remember, like, I kind of couldn't wait until I was done. So, I don't know. Most people enjoy the book, so I wouldn't say that I wouldn't recommend it to anybody, but it wasn't for me. And actually, maybe I should get rid of this. No. Richard Brookhiser, James Madison. Can you see a pattern going on here? Richard Brookhiser is seriously one of my favorite early American history authors. He's got such a chill voice, he's such a fun guy, and he really writes unbiased. Like, one of the only authors that I can trust to not inject his agenda. This was the first James Madison biography that I ever read. It's a fantastic introduction. If you don't know anything about James Madison, this is the book that I would say you should read first, because it takes you in a very easy pace throughout his life. It kind of excludes the really mundane, banal little details and just hits on all the important things, and it's a lot of fun, and it's not, like I said, not biased, and that's, like, the most important thing to me. So I really love it. Definitely, like, 10 out of 10 would recommend. This is a very good book, even though it's not necessarily the most comprehensive. Keeping it. The Intimate Lives of the Founding Fathers. Did you ever want to know about the Founding Fathers' sex lives? Well, guess what? There's a book all about it by Thomas Fleming. Now, Thomas Fleming is not one of my favorite early American history authors because he... Oh, hi, Noodle. This is my Noodle. She came to interrupt a book review. Anyway, I was saying Thomas Fleming, not my favorite guy because he tends to write... Well, first of all, I will say, after every good thing I said about Richard Brookhiser not writing with a bias, Thomas Fleming tends to write, like, noticeably with a bias, which, number one, not the greatest thing ever, and then number two, I recall not being a fan of his syntax. I think he writes in kind of a clipped voice. But that being said, I think the way this book is that he kind of goes through each of the founding fathers, like each chapter is dedicated to a founding father, so he just goes through them one by one and talks about how they and their wives met and how their relationship was and, like, all that kind of stuff. And definitely the most interesting chapter was probably either Benjamin Franklin or John Adams. They both had super interesting relationships with women. John Adams specifically with one woman, his wife, and Benjamin Franklin with a variety of women. But I mean, for every compunction that I have about Thomas Fleming, I think this is one of his better books. It's fun, it's informative, so if for some reason you're especially curious about the Founding Fathers in conjunction with their wives, then I would say this is the perfect book for you to read. Like, it's pretty much got all the information about that subject that you could want. So there you go. I didn't mean for me to go through all of my early American history books like in one chunk. They just all happen to be stored like together. So we can stop talking about early American history for a second and start talking about Star Trek. Q squared. So funny thing about this book, first of all, it's an extremely good book. This is one of the coolest sci-fi books that I've ever read. And I actually read it before I watched Star Trek Next Gen. I was already a huge fan of the Star Trek, the Kelvin timeline, and also the original series, so it was the Kirk and Spock and Bones kind of ensemble that I was really in love with, and because I loved that group, I didn't want to move on to Next Gen, but I felt like as a fan of Star Trek, I had to at some point. For some reason, I thought it was a good idea to, instead of watching Next Gen, to pick up a book about Next Gen. This could not have been a worse book to do that, because it actually starts out with an alternative universe, and obviously that's a big part of the plot because it has to do with a bunch of wibbly wobbly timey-wimey stuff. Because it starts out with an alternate universe, it writes all of the characters in a bunch of like positions and personalities that they don't have canonically, so I was very, very confused. Like, for example, in the beginning of this book, Data is actually human, and William Riker is the captain and not Jean-Luc Picard, and just like, oh, and Tasha Yar has long hair, and just like all this stuff. It's basically alternative versions of the cast. So I was going into this like thinking that that was the way the show was, and of course he gets into the canon version of the cast, and the two versions like meet each other because like time is collapsing in on itself because of this fucker from TOS. It's kind of almost like a TOS and Next Gen crossover, because he had this brilliant idea to have Q from the Next Gen be Tremaine's, or whatever this guy's name is, Tremaine, I think so, to be his mentor. And he just starts coming along and acting like a child and messing everything up like he does. So despite the initial confusion that I had in my unique situation in regard to reading the book, it was an extremely fascinating book, and I got through it really quickly, and it was just super fun. So definitely, for some reason, like, you want to read a Star Trek book, this is an excellent Star Trek book to read. And I'm saying that as a person that knew nothing about Next Gen when I was reading it. So just a good book. Just a good book in general. I wasn't going to review any children's books, because I do have a few of those in this mess, but I'm not gonna say much about these. Just Alvin and the Chipmunks was a very big part of my childhood. You can judge me, it's fine. Not much to say about the junior novels for the movies other than they're about as good as the movies they're based on, so you can do with that information what you will. Next, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid. So this is, I believe, an autobiography. This guy, Pat F. Garrett, is the guy that killed Billy the Kid, and he wrote this book to document kind of Billy the Kid's life and the events in his own life that led up to him busting Billy the Kid. I remember, like, seriously not enjoying the book because, as you can tell, it's very dense, and usually that doesn't bother me, but I just remember being very bored. But it is a very fascinating primary source if you care at all about Wild West part of American history, and the premise is super interesting, but Garrett's sort of approach to writing all this information is just, it's super, super dense, super, super long-winded, and just, I'm probably just not as adventurous or as cool or as suspenseful as you would think, but this is nonfiction. This is not a dramatized version of what happened with Billy the Kid, and it's fascinating because Garrett, I remember, wrote with a very apologetic approach to kind of the circumstances, and he did not want to kill Billy the Kid, and when it did happen, he was not happy about it, and I think that he thought that Billy the Kid was a very sympathetic young guy who was very misled and very misunderstood, and so it's interesting kind of hearing that take from the guy that ultimately did the deed that ended his life. So you can sort of interpret it the way you want with, you know, the ethical implications of what Pat Garrett had to do, but definitely an interesting premise reading a biography about a person written by the guy that killed that person. So, you know, it's cool. It's you gotta have kind of a certain a certain taste to be able to get through a book like this, but it's a valuable primary source. 6 out of 10 would recommend, depending on who you are. The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. I think you would technically characterize it as a self-help book, but it's more of a kind of like lifestyle philosophy theory book. Like, I would definitely characterize it more as theoretical than advisory. Definitely a good book. Not something I would snuff my nose at. And I have so many Chip and Dale's Rescue Rangers comic books that I will never get rid of. Okay, so I definitely am not getting rid of my Rescue Rangers comic books. I will always keep my Rescue Rangers comic books. I will cherish them until I die. Did I read this? I don't think I read this. Retribution? I didn't even know that I had this. Oh my god, is this a Transformers Prime book? Because that looks like Transformers Prime Megatron in the reflection of Optimus Prime's mask. I didn't know that I even had this book. I do not remember buying it. I didn't read it, so I can't review it. I can review Transformers Prime, but I'm not gonna. This is not the video for that. Madison's Gift, another Madison biography. Wow, who'da thunk? And this one is by, whoa, David O. Stewart. Ugh, boy, I feel so bad that these books are all so dusty. It's basically just a thematically organized sort of biopic about Madison's ability to accomplish things by collaborating with people. Like, that was his main method of work, so David O. Stewart like really chose to focus on that, but I felt like it was surprisingly underemphasized, and because it was organized thematically and not chronologically, it was all over the place, and it was, if you didn't know a lot about Madison prior, like, I feel like this would be kind of hard to follow. I don't know, I wouldn't like recommend this book first if you want to learn about James Madison or the Founding Fathers, but it's like easy to read. It's an easy read, and it's got an interesting, nonetheless underexplored premise, so I'd say like 6 out of 10. I'd give it a 6 out of 10. Noodle is in my bookshelf. This is what I get for cleaning out my bookshelf. It is no longer a bookshelf and it becomes a noodle shelf. Are you eating, are you eating a hair clip? Oh my god, I've been recording for 45 minutes! Networks of Outrage and Hope by Manuel Castells. This book was, hey, shut up, Jake from State Farms. It's basically about sort of revolutions, like, or political movements, like, oh my god, Noodle moving my camera. It's basically about political movements that got started online and how the internet has kind of helped evolve and influence political movements like Occupy Wall Street, and how it's like brought people together politically. And at least I think that's what the premise of the book was, but I just remember being extremely bored and I couldn't wait till it was over, and when I finally finished it, I felt like I was freed from an egregious burden. Like, I really loved the premise of the book, and I still, like, think it's a great premise. It's just, you need to be very, very, very patient to get through something like this. I don't even really remember too much of it. I just remember not particularly enjoying it and being disappointed, so that's all I have to say about that. Tubes by Andrew Bloom. This was another extremely boring book that had a great premise and was nonetheless difficult to get through. This one was about the physicality of the internet, so everybody kind of thinks of the internet as this abstract and worldwide network, this sort of nebulous, bodiless entity, but Andrew Bloom set out to kind of talk about and pontificate on how the internet exists as a physical entity, meaning the actual literal tubes and the wires and the buildings and the companies and the headquarters that sort of make the internet operate. It's, God, I don't know. It's like one of these things where the premise is so fascinating and the execution is so excruciatingly boring, but I don't know, that's just me. Maybe somebody else with more patience and a better attention span would be able to get through this book easier, but it was another one where I couldn't wait till it was over, and when it was over, I felt so relieved. So that's Tubes. Elixir by Hilary Duff. Yes, it's that Hilary Duff. Listen, this is a disclaimer. I love Hilary Duff. I have always loved Hilary Duff. She was my favorite pop star when I was little. That being said, a girl cannot write. Now listen. This is just my opinion. No need to get mad. This does not mean that I dislike Hilary Duff. I'm not saying she's not smart. I'm not saying anything bad about her as a person. I'm just saying, like, given my personal taste and how I look at books and, like, my approach to literature and whatever, like, Hilary Duff ain't got it. She very much wrote, like, a YA book. It's not just, like, in the YA genre. It's, like, it encapsulates the connotation of the designation YA. Very quickly paced, which is not a problem in and of itself. It's just that it's just kind of unconsidered and silly. The characters are all super boring and kind of lacking any unique qualities or personalities. There is no theme or dramatic question in the book. There's no ethical kind of underpinnings. There's no ethical questions. There's no like reason for you to read the book other than to be entertained. It's like seriously a grocery store formula fiction book. Like that's all it is. And some people are into that and that's great. I don't really like that. It's the kind of book where the characters are really stupid and do stupid things because if they weren't and they didn't, the plot would not advance. So yeah, it's super, super, super tropey and it's super silly and it's like, the premise is not like the worst. It's about like this girl that is a photojournalist. She's like a 23-year-old photojournalist that is so successful and travels the world and all this stuff, and she like looks through all her pictures and realizes for the first time somehow that there's always this guy in her pictures, and she comes to find out that this man has been reincarnated for the past like 500 years, but then somehow remembers all his past lives and finds the soul of his lover, who is the main character in every one of his reincarnated lives, but she can't remember, but he wants to be with her every time, but he has to resist because she always dies and forgets him. Like, okay, kind of dumb. Like, you could still do something with it. This ain't it. And yes, if you're wondering, that is Hilary Duff on the cover. She did model for the cover of her own book, which, you know what, girl, that's fine. Go off, I guess. Whatever. Just write. Don't worry about mordant critics like me. Just write what you want to write. What's this? Oh, The Lincoln Lawyer by Michael Connelly? Is that who? Yes, Michael Connelly. So this is kind of a legal drama book written by... Well, I already said who it was written by. God damn it, I'm starting to get really tired already. Basically, I read this, I think, in 7th grade. From what I remember, I really enjoyed the book. I didn't have, like... I mean, granted, I wasn't the most critically erudite. I was in 7th grade. I enjoyed it, and I persuaded my mom to read it, and she enjoyed it, and I think a lot of people enjoyed it because it was a successful book and a movie was based on it. So it's kind of one of those, like, grocery store sort of, like, formula fiction dramas. It's, like, not the deepest, and it doesn't really have anything to teach you, but it's written pretty intelligently. Like, Michael Connelly is a very competent, very capable writer. It's paced nicely. The characters are, like, they're pretty bland, like they tend to be in books like this, but they're interesting enough, and you can get through this book pretty easily. So I would give it, like, I don't even know why I'm giving some books ratings. Like, I think I'm getting through all these books, and like every once in a while I decide to give it a something out of 10 rating, but I'm gonna give this book a rating, and I'm gonna say that it's 7 out of 10. 7 out of 10, solid. Okay, this was a book that I started and never finished. It's by Andrew Burstein, who, if you remember from earlier, co-wrote Madison and Jefferson, and this book I never finished because, let's see, how far did I get? 70 pages. I got 70 pages in and decided that it was extremely boring, and this is what I mean about Andrew Burstein. He came up with this really interesting... I'm sorry, but you're making a lot of noise. Can you make less noise? He came up with this really interesting premise about writing about prophetic dreams that historical figures have had, and like figured out a way to make it extremely boring. So 3 out of 10, wouldn't recommend. I couldn't even finish it. Yet another James Madison book. Can you tell who my favorite historical figure was in high school? So this book, it's called James and Dolly Madison. It's about Bruce Chadwick. This book is horrible. I mean, it is very, very bad. Like, I'm not even joking about it. It is so, I remember that it's like the editor died. It's like, seriously, like there was no editor for this book. The syntax is really, really awful. There's a ton of misinformation. There's a ton of repetition. It could have been probably 300 pages shorter than it is. That is to say, it's 400 pages, but no, I'm serious. Like, it's like he kept repeating the same things over and over again, and a lot of the stuff that he said wasn't even true, and I'm not exactly a professional historian, but even I knew that. Like, there's nothing worse about a history book than just giving blatant misinformation. And it wasn't the type of misinformation where the author had an agenda and was like twisting facts. It was literally like he just didn't know what he was talking about. Like, I remember him, like, he said at one point that James Madison moved back into his house when he was middle-aged and he lived with his father who was like in his 80s, but James Madison's father died when he was like 78 or something, so that would have been like historically impossible. And it's just like a bunch of little things like that. He just got a lot of things wrong, so I don't know. The Madisons as a couple is like super underemphasized. That's like 0 out of 10, would not recommend. Okay, here's my Usagi Yojimbo comic books. Chippendale, rescue rain, Chippendale, when there's danger. Oh no, it never failed once they're involved. Somehow whatever's wrong gets solved. Okay, let's do this one. The Three Musketeers. Must have been 12 or 13 years old when I read this, and that is not the right age to read this book. Like, somehow I managed to get through the whole thing in a reasonable amount of time, but there was definitely a lot of big chunks where I didn't understand what was happening. And that's not necessarily because Alexander Dumas, great guy, really hilarious. Like, I really love the way that he writes his characters. Such a great author, and if you haven't read a Dumas book, you definitely got to do that before you die. But there's definitely, he has this habit of using a lot of historical, political, and literary allusions. Like, he alludes to the Bible, he alludes to Don Quixote. Like, he spends the first 10 pages of this book comparing the main protagonist to Don Quixote, and when I was 12, I did not know who Don Quixote was. I did not even know how to pronounce Quixote. So there's just kind of like, you sort of have to have some pre-knowledge to be able to get through this easily. And I'm like, and if you don't, then I still think you should read this if you're an adult. Like, you can still get a lot out of it. There's a lot of twists and turns. The characters are really fun and interesting, and the way they interact with each other is like really funny. But I also remember really loving the villain of this book. Even as a 12-year-old, like, I thought Milady was just so badass. Like, she was so evil and crazy, and she like freaking like carried poison around in a ring, and like I just thought that shit was just so cool. So definitely, like, this is a very awesome book. I should reread it now because I feel like I could appreciate it a lot more at this age. I did start to reread it. It's just, as you can see, she thick, kind of, you know, it's kind of a big time commitment, but well worth it. I would say it's well worth it. 10 out of 10 would recommend. More comic books, more Chip and Dales, Rescue Rangers. Chip and Dale with his danger. Oh no, it never fails. They'll take the clues and find the ways and whys and who's. Here's a Robin Hood book that I bought from the Brandywine River Museum because N.C. Wyeth did the illustrations. It's for children, and like, I'd say, like, if you want it, just kind of get it for the paintings. I really love N.C. Wyeth. He's one of my favorite illustrators of all time. And I really enjoyed this book because, I mean, it's obviously not the most comprehensive Robin Hood tale that you could ever read, but Will Stutely is in it a lot, and Will Stutely is my favorite merry man. And if you're like, who the hell is Will Stutely? That's the problem with most Robin Hood updates and iterations. I mean, like, I know I'm the only person on the planet that has this opinion, but I can't stand how underrated and excluded Will Stutely is. Like, he was one of the only merry men that was like really close to Robin Hood and can kind of tell him what to do, because he had this like wisdom and experience about him, and he was kind of like sort of an older brother figure to Robin Hood, but he had like a good sense of humor. Like, he was almost like a young Obi-Wan. Like, just such an interesting character, and I loved him so much in the Howard Pyle version of Robin Hood, and now he's always usurped by like Little John and Will Scarlet, and that just sucks. Like, hashtag justice for Will Stutely 2020. Okay, Bumblebee and Me by Dan Gilvezan. I basically wrote my high school graduation thesis like in huge part based on this book because I thought it was so fascinating, and it's, as you can see, very short. It's very short and laconic. But Dan Gilvezan, who, if you didn't know, was the original voice for Bumblebee in the 1980s G1 Transformers cartoon, and he's got just a great sense of humor and a really natural kind of fluid writing voice, and he kind of in this book just talks about what it was like being the voice of a Transformer in the 80s and why the cartoon sort of got canceled and what his co-workers were like. Like, he kind of talks a little bit about what it was like working with Peter Cullen and Frank Welker. So, and I'm a huge sucker for, like, I just love appreciating the hell out of voice actors. I really, really love Transformers. Bumblebee is my favorite Transformer. Dan Gilvezan is like such a classic voice actor. I think he's most famous for doing Bumblebee and also one of the original Spider-Man cartoons. So I know this is like super kind of niche-y, but definitely if you care about 80s cartoons, nostalgia, Transformers, voice acting, anything like that, then this is like a must read. And like, if you're not into any of that, I don't know how much you would enjoy this book, but for a person like me, like 10 out of 10, would recommend. So enjoyable. Tuesdays with Morrie. This is one of the only 3 books I ever read in my whole life that actually made me cry. It's basically kind of semi-autobiographical, but also fictional narrative about a guy that is sort of nursing one of his old professors when he's, I think, got a terminal illness, or he's kind of just like going to die in the very foreseeable future. So he interviewed this professor about his life and his perspective, and kind of accumulated the interviews in this book and wrote about what it was like taking care of Morrie. It's got a bit of a like life advice underpinning, but it's not preachy. Just a really, really good, touching book, and it definitely made me emotional, and that does not happen very often when I read. Mitch Albom has a very kind of like simplistic approach to writing, but it's definitely not unconsidered or unintelligent. It's like super palatable, so definitely, like, I would say 10 out of 10. I think everybody should read that book. Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. Cortana was not talking to you. Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer is a non-fictional book about a man who summited Mount Everest with a group of other people, I think in the 1990s, and the group ended up being hit by a big storm, and it was very disastrous. A lot of people died. It was a really big news event. And he wrote, at the time, what was a pretty controversial autobiography about that specific event. He writes very palatably about a very serious, tragic subject, and his take on the events that happened and kind of the fallout with people as a result of him publishing this book. This book is like a mess of annotations. I think I read this for school, so that might be why the annotations are so dense, but despite having an obligation to read this, like, I immensely enjoyed it, and I think that anybody could enjoy reading this book. I would say 10 out of 10 recommend. Just be prepared for the non-fictional recollection of extremely unfortunate events. It's like not exactly the happiest book that you could ever read. It's very tragic and sad. Oh god, I'm like, whew. This is gonna be a pain in the butt to edit. This is over an hour of footage. Oh my god. Traitor Wins! L.A. Graff. Another Star Trek book. This book is so good. Oh my god. I should reread this. I loved this book so much. It's basically about Chekhov and Sulu getting framed for murder, which I know sounds like kind of an out there premise, but it centers around them dealing with the fallout and running away from getting convicted, I guess, and then Captain Kirk is trying to prove them innocent, and all of your favorite characters are in it. Uhura and Scotty are all in it. I don't remember if Spock is in it. I kind of don't think that he is. I don't think you would miss him too much. I mean, this book is just so enjoyable, and L.A. Graff, I remember I was so like pleasantly surprised by what a natural and sophisticated voice that he had in his writing. It's, you know, not an encumbering book. It's not terribly dense. It's not too loose. It's like, it's just perfect. Man, I just loved this book. So I know that this is another like really niche-y thing. If you're not a Star Trek fan, then I guess you wouldn't want to read a Star Trek book. It is so very good. It's like very suspenseful, very, very evocative, very everything. Really love Traitor Wins. Really good book. Okay, this is a book called Finding Home by J.A. Del Camp. I seriously doubt that anybody watching this has heard of or read this book, but it is very, very near and dear to my heart. The author, J.A. Del Camp, sent it to me personally as a gift, and when I first got into Civil War reenacting, Del Camp was a mentor to me from a distance. It's basically just about kind of an ensemble of soldiers during the Civil War and their experiences together. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the characters. There's like this crazy twist right at the end that I wasn't expecting, and it totally threw me for a loop, and it was super exciting, and I really just love it for sentimental reasons because one of, you know, the most important mentors in my reenacting career wrote it, and that means a lot to me that she sent it to me. Okay, let's see. Oh boy. Oh boy. Time's Arrow by, who is this by? Martin Amis. This was a book that I read my first year of college for class. It's kind of experimental, like I don't remember too much about it, but I do still think about the concept from time to time because orology and the space-time continuum is sort of a philosophical conjecture that I enjoy thinking about, and this kind of tackles the idea of time by actually writing a book in reverse sequence. And you know, as to the story itself, like I really don't remember it, but I just remember thinking that the premise was very captivating. So I think this is a rare example of something where you'd read it almost exclusively for the premise and not worry too much about The content, something you should pick up if you're looking for something unusual. We Are Anonymous by Parmy Olson. It's a non-fictional book about the kind of origins and thereafter sort of the events surrounding the hacktivism group Anonymous, and it was formed in the early 2000s from 4chan and kind of grew from there into different factions. Parmy Olson looked into some primary sources and she interviewed one of the most famous Anonymous/LULsec hackers, Jake Davis, in order to compose this book. It is extremely factual, it's written in an extremely personable voice, and it's just like, it's such a good retrospective of not just Anonymous and LULsec and other hacktivism groups, but also just the history of hacking in general, the history of the internet, the history of internet culture. If you're fascinated at all by things like hacking and internet culture and forums and the history of those things, then this is one of the best books you can read. Okay, this is a book that I haven't read, but I just want to say that I for sure stole this book from my high school, so I'm sorry to that teacher that I stole this from. I know that you said to give it back. I did not mean to keep it, but now I have it, and now it's mine. Alright, I'll review this one real quick, but I didn't finish it, so I feel like I shouldn't technically be reviewing it, but it's called Michael Jackson, The Magic, the Madness, the Whole Story by biographer J. Randy Taraborelli? I hope I'm saying that right, I don't know. This book I read, I think, in 6th grade, so I was probably 11 or 12 years old. It is, I think, around 900 pages, and it's around 750 pages. And it is about, well, what do you think it's about? I was a huge fan of Michael Jackson and the Jackson 5 in middle school, and I picked up this book because I wanted to learn more about him, because when I'm a fan of something, I can't simply just be a fan of it, I have to know freaking everything. And it looks like, based on the bookmark, that I only got 400 odd pages through this book, so I guess about halfway, a little more than halfway. And what I read was extremely comprehensive and easy to read and easy to follow. Granted, there's a lot of adult themes in this book, and I definitely lost some of my early innocence by reading this. But if you're looking for a biography about MJ that is interesting and comprehensive, this is definitely the book. I have very fond memories of reading this book, and I remember thinking it's extremely fascinating, so even though I didn't finish it, I would still recommend it. This is gonna be a pain to edit. Why do I do this to myself? Oh my god, there are so many other books. I have so many books. Oh Jesus. Oh Jesus. I'm just gonna end it here. I have other books in other parts of my room, but I am very tired, and my back is sore from sitting in this position, and I've already gone through like 100 books. So I'm gonna call it a night, and maybe I'll do the rest in a part 2. And I know that nobody got through this entire video, but if for some reason you're seeing this, thank you so much for watching, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I would really like to get to 32 subscribers by the time that I'm 50 years old. I'm going to put all these books back on the shelf now in a very organized manner, and I'm going to donate the 3 books that I decided I could deal with parting with. So thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful night. Stay inside. Wash your hands. And, and Noodle loves you. Right, Noodle? Right. Yes, okay. Okay. Oh, God.